Okay, so we're into our third of the series of sharing the good news, and we're talking about the cross-cultural experiences surrounding that this evening. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. So as you've no doubt guessed, the idea of listening to the experiences of the Coddles and asking the question of family time all tie in together with this idea of what does cross-cultural mission have to do with sharing the good news. So of course, when we think of the good news and sharing it, we need to understand and be able to articulate what the good news is. And people have different ways of explaining this. What I've found most helpful in terms of explaining the good news is explaining that in terms of relationships. The good news is that there can be good relationships. The first relationship, of course, is with us and God. And without Jesus in our lives, we have the relationship of an enemy to God. But with Jesus, accepting him into our lives, we become part of God's family. We become his children. And so that relationship is healed, is made right. The second relationship that is important for each one of us is, who am I? How do I understand who I am and am valued? And the important thing there is to recognize that as a son or daughter of God, that defines who I am. It's not about what other people think of me. It's not about my experiences in the past of my failures or successes, but it's God and me being part of his family that defines who I am. And then, of course, we have relationships one with another, and we want good and healthy relationships there too. And without Jesus in our lives, so many of our relationships fall apart for all sorts of different reasons. But with Jesus in our lives, we have the opportunity for reconciliation, for restoration, and those relationships can be good and become part of that good news. And finally, the relationship between us and our world, God's creation, is an important one as well. And without Jesus in our lives, so many of us see this world as something to be exploited, taken advantage of, whatever I need for myself. But with Jesus in our lives, we need to change that attitude and recognize that we were called to work to be stewards of this creation, to help it be the best that it can be. And so that relationship can be healed as well. And so to me, if we look at the good news in terms of those relationships, all of those relationships can only be made right through Jesus, through his life, his death on the cross, the resurrection, and who he is in God. And so that's what forms the good news that we can share with other people. So we're going to be looking at John chapter 4, verses 4 to 42, and we're not going to be looking at every verse, but you're welcome to open it up on your screens or open up your Bibles so that you can see the parts that I'm referencing. But I'm just wanting to pull out some major points from this story that can help us, I believe, help us as we try to share the good news in different cultural experiences. And the first point that I've taken out of this story is that Jesus understood the cultural background. So what's happening in this story is that Jesus is traveling from Galilee to Judea, and he's going through Samaria, and he comes to this village of Sychar, which is part of Samaria. Now, just on its own, that doesn't tell us too much, but there's a lot of history there that's very important for us to understand. When the northern kingdom of Israel was taken away by Assyria, way back in the 500-600 BC, the people there were dispersed and new people were moved into the area. And so the whole makeup of the people groups living in what was the northern kingdom of Israel, or the area of Samaria, was changed. Now, some of the Israelites stayed and they intermarried with the new people coming in. But even before that, when the northern kingdom was established, there was a new set of religious observances created because they didn't want to have to go to Jerusalem to worship God. And so these things form a huge part of the cultural background of how the Jews viewed Samaritans and how Samaritans view Jews. And it was not a friendly relationship at all. Jews in particular wouldn't associate with Samaritans. They thought that they were not right and that they would be polluting the people of Jewish faith in the time of Jesus if they were to associate with them. So when Jesus goes into this place where there is a well near a village, and there's the situation that Jesus is thirsty. So Jesus obviously knew the cultural background, that was part of his culture, but for us to understand what's going on, we needed to have that kind of historical context. Because then Jesus asks a question and he makes himself vulnerable. He's thirsty and he goes to this woman and says, "Please give me a drink." Now, this is shocking. For a Jewish man to be addressing a Samaritan is shocking in itself. For a Jewish single man to be addressing a woman, let alone a Samaritan, is even more shocking. But Jesus goes to this lady and says, "Please give me a drink." He's not approaching her from a position of power where he's imposing his culture, his beliefs on her. He's just asking her to help him. But as he does this, he gets into a discussion with her and he offers hope. He talks about the difference between the water and the well, which once drunk, people will get thirsty once again and need more and more. But he's saying he can offer something better than that. And so he says to this lady, "But those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again." It becomes a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life. Jesus is offering an amazing hope to this lady who has to come out during the middle of the day to get her water because she won't be able to associate with the other women of the village who would normally go out early in the morning or later in the evening when the sun's not so strong. She's been ostracized. She is marginalized in her own village, in her own setting. But Jesus is offering her something very, very special. But Jesus doesn't shy away from the truth when he's offering hope. So he recognizes this lady's situation and he asks her to go and get her husband. But of course, the lady doesn't have a husband currently. She's living with a man who's not her husband, and she's had a whole number of husbands before this. And that's why she's being ostracized by the village. We don't know what's happened before, why those husbands stopped the relationship, whether they died, whether they left her, whatever it was, we don't know. But we can understand from the context of what's happening here is the village is not happy with these relationships that she's had. And she is very much on her own as far as the village is concerned, but living with this man who's not her husband. And Jesus doesn't shy away from that. He doesn't pretend that there is no problem with this, because it is something that needs to be addressed in her life. And then the important moment, at least what I think is the important moment, is where he introduces himself in terms of who he is. The lady has pointed out that they as Samaritans are looking forward to the day when the Messiah, who is also called the Christ, is going to come and explain all the things that are going on in their lives and how they can worship well. And Jesus says, I am the Messiah. What a bold claim. And of course, when we're dealing with people from another culture, we're not going to go up and say, I am the Messiah. But we're able to introduce people to who Jesus is. When we're offering hope in terms of restored relationships, hope in terms of identity, hope in terms of making a difference in their situations, we need to introduce Jesus, because it's only through Jesus that that hope can be fulfilled. And of course, it's only through Jesus that our hope can be fulfilled, and is the reason why we're wanting to share the good news in the first place. And then there's the opportunity to repair relationships. This lady accepts who Jesus is, and that changes everything for her, and it's going to change everything for the village where she lives as well. So she leaves her water jar beside the well, runs back to the village, telling everyone, come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could he possibly be the Messiah? So the people came streaming from the village to see him. And there's so much in these sentences in terms of what's actually going on here. So this woman has received good news about Jesus. She's accepted it and she wants to share it. And that's good in itself. But the way that she's able to share that is to go back to her village and tell everybody about it. And this is the village where no one wants to talk to her, where she's not accepted, where she's pushed aside. But she is the one, she's the one who is able to bring the good news to them. I find that so amazing. And this is what Jesus does. If you look through the whole of the Gospels and you see how Jesus interacts with people and the needs that they have, so often he meets their need and then he brings them back into a right relationship with those around them. You can read these stories for yourselves, but I think you'll find that it's true. And it's so important because we're not meant to be alone. And so all of our relationships can be repaired, can be restored, can be reconciled when we accept Jesus into our lives. As this lady accepts Jesus into her lives, she, through spreading the good news, makes disciples. Jesus has made her into a disciple, and then she makes disciples. So many of the Samaritans from the village believed in Jesus because the woman had said, he told me everything I ever did. Isn't that a marvelous picture? Isn't that a story of what can happen in our lives and what has happened over the many centuries between this story and today? And this is what we have to be able to do if we want to engage with cross-cultural or any other form of sharing the good news. Then Jesus talks to his disciples about what's happened. And he's kind of summarizing what's going on here. And he said, I sent you to harvest where you didn't plant. Others had already done the work. And now you will get to gather the harvest. And I think Jesus is talking to us as much as he's talking to the disciples back in those days. God is working in so many people's lives before we get the opportunity to even introduce ourselves, let alone Jesus, to them. But we're being invited to join in the harvest. We can't claim anything special out of the process. We will see that the harvest is gathered in that people's lives can be changed. But we won't be able to claim that we made those changes. God is working in those people's lives already, and he's working independently of us. But we are being invited to join in God's mission, to see those lives be harvested, to be changed, to come to know Jesus, to come to be disciples, and then make disciples themselves. This is the marvelous story of sharing the good news. I think this chapter in John is just such a masterclass that Jesus provides us in how to engage in cross-cultural mission. And it's something that if we're willing to take on board, that we will see great fruit from the harvest that we engage in. So, what does that mean for us today? We have a question for us to think about. If we're going to engage in this process of sharing the good news and recognizing that whether it's in this country or another, there are so many cultures that we have to be aware of and history that we need to be sensitive to. So when you think of the way that Jesus interacted with this Samaritan woman, what do you think is the hardest part of the process that we've looked at? So when we go into our breakout rooms, have a discussion about that, and then wonder, how are we going to ask God, ask Jesus to help us engage well in that part of the process?